In our Western traditions, the reference being that demonstrated for us that possibility we now know as Jesus of Nazareth. In his lifetime, through the Essene traditions and others of the time, we're invited to allow for the possibility that this man, as a reference being, lived the greatest possibility of what it means to be human. He demonstrated for us, through the choices that he made in his life, the greatest possibility of our potential. And in doing so, he anchored it firmly into our memory so that we each could access that at some later time in history. And in the traditions of the Essenes, they constantly reference this time. They say, in those days, the weather patterns will change. In those days, crops won't grow in their season. In those days, you will do what our reference being has done, and much, much more during this time in history. It may be that we actually have a physical body of evidence to support the possibility of this phase transition in a very controversial relic of antiquity that is called the Shroud of Turin. Briefly, what I'd like to say about the shroud is simply this. The Shroud of Turin in the ancient literature is identified as the burial shroud for the man that we know as Jesus of Nazareth. For 500 years, we don't know where it was until about 1,500 years ago. 1,500 years ago, it surfaced and was shown publicly, and there is an image of a man emblazoned on the shroud, and how the image got there has been the subject of tremendous controversy and scientific debate ever since. In 1988, there was a study conducted by one scientist, and I believe that this study was the best study that was possible under the conditions and with the equipment that were available in 1988. And this study concluded that the shroud isn't real, that it was a hoax, created sometime perhaps in the 14th or 15th century by the great artists of that time. That story is the one that made the media, and that story is the one that many people believe to this day. And I'd like to offer you now another possibility. This is simply a possibility, so that you have all the information. In 1978, there was another study that didn't receive the publicity that the 88 study did 10 years later. It lasted for 5 years. It involved over 40 researchers. It was a multidisciplinary task force of computer scientists, forensic pathologists, biologists, chemists, historians, photographers. Over 30,000 images documented this 5-year study from some of the greatest laboratories of our time: Los Alamos National Labs in northern New Mexico, Sandia National Laboratories, part of Kirtland Air Force Base. In 1983, the study was complete, and it was released to the engineering community through symposiums and conferences, and it was never picked up well in the media. The studies indicate that the shroud actually dates to the time of Christ through the carbon-14 dating. That what appears to be blood on the shroud is in fact blood, that it is human blood, and there's so much blood there that it is actually typed. We have hemoglobin samples and bile pigments. That's how much blood there is on this shroud. Through the three-dimensional imaging, for the first time, we're able to actually provide dimensions to the man from the shroud. He was about 5 feet 11 inches tall and weighed 178 pounds. We'll never know precisely who the man in the shroud was. What we do know is that he underwent a biological process that is not explained by our physics and our chemistry today. And what the engineering report actually says is that the man inside the shroud underwent a rapid, intense heat process of biological origin that scorched his image onto the shroud through a process that's not explained in our science today. All the wounds on the body of this man match item for item the wounds described through the Essene texts and also the biblical texts. So although we don't know precisely who the man was, we know that this man underwent a process of energy, creating a biological heat. In the ancient traditions, that is the word that we give to the process we know is resurrection. And the resurrection process, we're invited to allow for the possibility that it transcends religion and science and mysticism, that perhaps it's a very natural state of affairs as each human lives the opportunity of expressing our greatest potential. As we go through the phase transition, the change in the magnetics and the change in the frequency of the earth, that the human form, as it goes through that same transition, is expressing itself is a higher or a greater modality. And that great expression, according to these ancient traditions, is what is suggested in this shroud. So it may be, if these traditions hold true, that we have at least one physical body of evidence to suggest that this phase transition has occurred at least once with at least one human in the last 2,000 years. And that opens up a vast array of possibilities and potential. Nearly every indigenous culture has had a name for what this time in history is all about. The Hopi, for example, call it the coming of the sixth world, or the beginning of the new dream. Researchers now that are witnessing the changes are calling this the magnetic shift to zero, or the time of the polar reversal, or a dimensional shift. Now others are calling this the time of 0 point. 0 point, that pivotal moment, that rare opportunity in history, when all these parameters converge on this time and this experience of space-time, where we may take all of the experience that we have ever had collectively and pivot from that point forward into something brand new that's never been done before. 0 point. We entitled this body of information Beyond 0 Point. And there's a reason for that. For so many people today, so many books and lectures and workshops that participants in our groups have shared, and they've shared these experiences with me, the focus has been on the phenomenon of the 0 point, on what we do when the magnetics fall, and what does it mean when we reach the point of the shift of the ages. The outer phenomenon, the sensationalism of that outer phenomenon. From my perspective, each of these events that are happening, the crop circles, the shift in the magnetics, the galactic phenomenon that we're seeing of new galaxies being birthed and new signals from within our Milky Way, as interesting as they all are, I believe they're byproducts of something much more significant. And that something is the change that's occurring within each of us in this moment. Is it possible that the greatest challenges of our lives, the challenges of health and survival, the greatest challenges of emotion in our lives, could they be the triggers that push us into the place within our lives where we must reach deep inside and awaken this great potential that lives within us? And that potential is what carries us across the threshold through this membrane of the time that we call 0 point, or the shift of the ages. Is it possible that that's happening? And I believe that this, the beyond 0 point, looking beyond the outer phenomenon of what's happening within our bodies, this is the possibility, this is the hope, this is the crux of this moment, this time in our lives. We'll bring these possibilities into play, and we'll explore this further for the rest of our program.
This concludes Session 1 of Beyond 0 Point with Gregg Braden. Our program continues with Session 2.